In our last class, we looked at how the conquest of the New World, the Americas, provided the material conditions or the money for a change in government in Europe, for the rise of absolute monarchies who claimed legitimacy based on divine right. So super powerful kings and queens who were able to fund private armies for themselves. Today, we're going to look at the other side of the story, the ideological effects of the colonization of the New World, which means like changes in the ways that people think. This is a long story with several different intellectual movements involved. So today we're going to really focus on the first one that laid the foundation for all the others to come, and that was called the Renaissance. Generally, our next set of lessons, though, are going to deal with these revolutions of the mind, these changes in the ways that people in Europe were understanding their world and their place in it, and the role of government, and the idea of rights, and their notions of science. And we're going to be thinking about to what extent these ideas can change the world. Starting with the rebirth of European culture, a time period called the Renaissance, which means rebirth. This is a time period that expressed change in all kinds of fields, from science to technology with the printing press to literature with Shakespeare. But it can really best be seen in the art of the time period. So we're going to be looking at that. Because we're talking about a change, it makes sense to contrast the Renaissance with the time period that came before. How are they different? Right? So we're going to be looking at what was different about the Renaissance from the medieval period from which it came. Last time when we looked at absolute monarchy, we already saw some pretty big changes. In the Middle Ages, monarchies were weak and they didn't have much money kicking around. Whereas in the early modern period, absolute monarchy was strong and pretty wealthy, especially compared to the early medieval version of kings and queens. The cool thing about the Renaissance is that it's completely possible to see the expansion of the European mind just through the art that was produced. So let's start with what it was like before. In the Middle Ages, art generally tended to be very flat, two-dimensional, pretty simple, the kind of thing that even I could draw. Art focused especially on the very top of the social hierarchy. So important people were made to seem physically larger than everybody else, and often they were the only subjects of drawing. So like art focused on religion and religious figures and on kings and queens. There was not a ton of detail. These were not super accurate drawings, and there weren't a ton of colors or blending or realism or anything really. Contrast that with what we began to see in the Renaissance. In the Renaissance, we get three-dimensional perspective that really requires an understanding of angles and geometry. You start to get more realistic and complex artwork. The subject matter changes too. You start to see regular people, like everyday ordinary people in settings, not just kings and biblical topics, though those are there too. Art in the Renaissance also revealed increased attention to trying to understand anatomy, like the human body, how it was realistic, and the world around them, and science, the natural world. And often in the Renaissance, artists weren't just artists. They dabbled in other fields of knowledge too. You've probably heard of at least 4 masters of the High Renaissance because the Ninja Turtles were named after them: Da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, and Donatello. So we're going to look at a couple of them now so you can kind of see what I mean. Also, warning, lots of naked people in Renaissance art because, you know, if you're focused on drawing a realistic body, they tended to do that naked. Anyway, Michelangelo was a sculptor, an artist, famous perhaps for the statue of David and the creation of Adam. I'm sure you've seen both. the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel church. And the drawing on the bottom left shows like how much attention artists started to pay to like muscle structure and skeletal structure. Leonardo da Vinci really was kind of the epitome of the Renaissance man, the kind of artist that you start to see during this time period. He did all kinds of things. He would dig up and dissect human bodies to understand anatomy and then produce sketches, which you can see on the slide now. He had notebooks full of inventions, including prototypes for a helicopter and a machine gun. He was a painter and a sculptor. He did all things well. He puts me to shame. Probably most famous for these three pieces. The Vitruvian Man, which shows like the proportion of different parts of the human body in relation to one another. The Last Supper and the Mona Lisa. As you can see, there's some pretty big differences between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance that are important to keep in mind, because they're going to explain the changes that we continue to look through in this unit. So first, in the Middle Ages, books were rare, and where they existed, they were copied by hand by monks in the church. So the church really controlled education. And people had a mindset of just believing in and obeying the teachings of the church. They didn't really question it much. Everyday people focused on the afterlife and getting to heaven way more than making their lives better on earth, because there wasn't really a way to do that with the feudal system. If people studied, it was mostly religious subjects and questions, not science. And people generally didn't think that they, as individuals, were important or could make a difference. People thought of themselves in terms of like class groups mostly. The few people who were educated mostly memorized what they were taught and repeated it, because books were rare, and so memorization was the key to storing knowledge. In this new time period we're talking about, the Renaissance, the printing press was invented, so you get more books cheaper, so spread around. This means that education and knowledge are no longer exclusively controllable by the church, which means that people begin to question what they've been told, with skepticism and rationalism. People start to focus on improving their lives on earth. This is called humanism, rather than focusing on like what happens after you die. And people start studying things that have more to do with earth than just religion, which is secularism, studying the natural world. People began to feel empowered as individuals to make a difference and try to improve their lives. And people began to think critically again and investigate questions instead of just repeating what they had been told. Books were easier to copy, so books store knowledge and people think about it. People don't have to just memorize things. So this gets us to the effect of exploration that's pretty fascinating and pretty indirect in terms of people's worldviews and the way they think about stuff. Remember, in the Middle Ages, things were focused on obedience, and now the theme's a lot more about curiosity and questioning. Colonies, trade, and taxes from the New World provided money for funding the arts and increased literacy, and they provided a spirit of inquiry or questioning and experimentation because of the newness of the New World. At the same time, following the Crusades especially, contact with other civilizations allowed Europeans to rediscover their classical roots. That means like rediscover the thinking from ancient Greece and ancient Rome that had been lost to Europe during the Middle Ages, but preserved in the Arab world, and that Europeans rediscovered through contact with the Arab world in the Crusades. Then came the invention of the printing press, which we're going to talk about in the next slide, but that was huge in terms of being able to spread the knowledge that was gained during this time. And all of these things led European worldviews to shift from the medieval feudal mindset to a new mode of thinking and art that was characterized by secularism, rationality, individualism, and humanism. In other words, rather than interpreting the world exclusively through Catholic beliefs and accepting it the way it was, people began to find ways to improve their lives, and then they began to believe in their ability to do that. The printing press was revolutionary in this regard because it was the technology that allowed these developments to have huge consequences. It was a machine made with movable type and a press so that it could copy books instead of having people have to like literally write out copies by hand. Its effects were huge. First, ideas could be spread widely and over long distances. Second, books became less expensive, so more people could afford to read, so more people read. And third, this is especially important as we get to the scientific revolution. Thinkers could build off of each other's research and work, even if they were separated by long distances, either in time or in space. So nobody had to like reinvent the wheel, so to speak, with every generation. You could look at what Copernicus was writing, perhaps, about his ideas about like maybe the Earth circles the sun and not the other way around. And then like, I don't know, maybe if your name's Galileo, you invent a telescope and you observe that, and then you publish your findings, and then other scientists build on it too. Because of all of this, it became more difficult for people in power, specifically the king and the Catholic Church, to contain or suppress ideas that they thought were threatening. And that's going to change the world. There were 5 key characteristics of Renaissance thought, and if any of these are completely new to you, it's worth pausing the slide here to jot down some definitions. Secularism just means not having to do with religion. It doesn't mean against religion, it just means it's off topic. So like, our history class is secular because I'm not teaching you religious beliefs, I'm teaching you about the history of the world. 2, skepticism means questioning what you're told, doubt. Teenagers, you're very good at this. 3rd, rationality means based on proof and logic, kind of like Greek rationalism. It's the opposite of faith. 4th, individualism means every individual person is unique and is capable of accomplishing things. Individual people have rights and freedoms that should be expected. These are new ideas in this time period. And then finally, humanism means focusing on human beings and their accomplishments instead of focusing on religion or heaven or God. It means seeking rational ways to solve human problems. Contrast this again with the way that people thought in the Middle Ages before, when mostly people obeyed what they were told. It was characterized by obedience and faith in authority. And people were seen as their feudal class, not as individuals. And they focused on heaven for a better life instead of working on the earth now, here and now, to make things better. During this time period, then, European culture experienced a rebirth, which is literally what Renaissance means in French. The term refers to a time period, right, a really long one from like 1400 to 1600, and it involved not just art, not just thinking differently, but also like literature. Shakespeare was part of this time. Machiavelli, a great writer on politics and power, was part of this movement. Copernicus, a scientist, was part of this time period. During this time, humanist thought revived art and learning in Europe. And Renaissance thinking stressed the use of reason and pushed people to become well-rounded scholars, focusing on logical understandings of the world instead of traditional explanations. This, as you guys saw, was reflected in artwork, where artists used geometry to master perspective and emphasized individual characteristics to make art as realistic as possible. It was also reflected in politics, where Machiavelli used logical reasoning to advise kings on how best to keep their power. It's a great book called The Prince. You guys should read it. Downplaying the importance of religion and morality and emphasizing the use of what is practically effective. In terms of long-term impact, again, huge. Renaissance thought promoted thinking that was focused on human rather than religious affairs. It increased the use of reason and mathematical and scientific knowledge to explain the world, instead of relying on the church. The concept of a Renaissance man developed. At this time period, a Renaissance man refers to somebody who's good in lots of different fields, knows Greek and Latin, knows history, a gifted writer, uses reason and logic to understand the world. During this time period, more authors wrote about secular, non-religious subjects than before, and they wrote books in the local language instead of Latin. It's called the vernacular, the way that people spoke. So more people could read more books. Many of the texts rediscovered during this time period dealt with science, and for the first time in centuries, Europeans could read works by ancient scientists, after which they set out to make their own scientific advances. Some scholars thought about mathematics as a way to understand the universe. They studied ancient math texts and started to build on these ideas. In the process, they created symbols that we still use in math today, like for square root, for positive and negative numbers. And advances in math, and also the tendency to think about the world as a place that follows rules, like mathematical rules, led to advances in other fields of science, which we'll see when we get to the scientific revolution. The theme here is people are starting to question what they've previously taken on faith or not thought about at all. And they're starting to investigate questions for themselves instead of relying on traditional authority figures for answers. And because of the printing press, this new knowledge, which is threatening to the Catholic Church and to the king and to people in power, also becomes harder for these authorities to control. So we've summarized a good amount of information. At this point, you can pause the slide and make sure these key points are in your notes, but then press play again so we can look at one effect of all of these changes that affected religion, the Protestant Reformation. So notes now, then press play again. So let's think about how this might all affect the Catholic Church. During the Middle Ages, only church officials ever actually read the Bible. People got their religious beliefs from going to church, and people believed that only the church could interpret the Bible for them. Bibles, furthermore, were only written in Latin, not the common language. So even if the average person had them, which they didn't, and even if the average person could read, which they couldn't, they wouldn't be able to read them anyway because they were in Latin. Also, very few people could read during this time. Then came the Renaissance and the printing press. What do you think is going to happen for religion? Well, by way of a hint, let's review. New World colonies give money to Europe, which is then used to fund art and intellectual activity. It also changes the way they look at the world. The encounter between European populations and, to them, whole new kinds of human beings with a whole lot of new plants and animals they'd never seen before lead Europeans to start to be curious about nature and science and start to question some of the assumptions about humanity. What is human nature anyway, man? But also question some of the assumptions about what they've been told generally. At the same time, New World colonies provide a lot of money to absolute monarchs who use divine right theory for legitimacy, which means the right to rule. In other words, they claim that they have the right to all of this power because God says so. During the Renaissance, Europeans rediscovered their ancient Greek and Roman cultural heritage, and they began to build off of it, rediscovering rationalism, philosophy, science, math, creating a lot of really pretty art in the process. This is possible because of the Crusades. Increased trade after the Crusades meant more contact with other parts of the world generally, and the Muslim world in particular, who had preserved all of this Greek and Roman knowledge after the Roman Empire fell and Europe entered the Dark Ages. So because of contact with the Arab world, Europe rediscovered its own past and was able to experience this time of Renaissance, rebirth. The ideas that came out of the Renaissance include skepticism, humanism, rationalism, individualism, and secularism. And the printing press spreads those ideas. These ideas then challenge the extent to which kings and the Pope can control the populations of Europe, leading to the Protestant Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, and the Enlightenment. Huge world-changing events, all of them. We're going to look at the first, briefly, the Protestant Reformation. And this is like the teeny tiny version of a complicated event. So the Pope, right, the head of the Catholic Church, he wanted to redo St. Peter's Basilica. You see it on the slide. It's big, it's fancy, it costs an insane amount of money. To raise the money for the renovations that he wanted, he began selling indulgences. An indulgence was, and again I'm simplifying, something that you could buy that the Pope said then gave you access to heaven. It was purchasing salvation. This is pretty corrupt, and it wasn't long before people started to notice that this was like not the best way to run a church. One of the people who noticed was named Martin Luther in Germany. He was like, this is bad. I have a problem with it. Actually, I have 95 problems with the church. He wrote them down. He nailed them to a cathedral door where everybody could read them and see them. And this act set off what's called the Protestant Reformation, which was a split in European Christianity. Protests against the corruption of the Catholic Church led to a new form of Christianity to compete with Catholicism. This new form started with the protest. It's called Protestantism. Protestants rejected the hierarchy and authority of the Pope and the Catholic Church, and they thought that paying for salvation in the form of indulgences was like super bad. Protestants said, you don't actually need the Pope. You don't need to pay for salvation. Read the Bible and interpret it yourself. This was an individualist route to salvation, by faith alone, a very Renaissance idea. It's the kind of thing that can only become possible with the printing press too, when people can actually have Bibles themselves to read. And it's part of the think for yourself trend that wasn't going to stop with just a change in religion. This doesn't mean that everybody became Protestant. In fact, this set off a whole series of religious wars between Protestants and Catholics in Europe that actually go on till actually my lifetime if you count Ireland, but we'll get there later. In the short term, the impact was pretty big. Before the Reformation, Europe was united behind one single faith, Catholicism, directed by a super powerful institution, the Catholic Church, which was led by an incredibly powerful dude called the Pope. By the end, Europe was divided religiously between Protestant and Catholic states, and strong monarchs filled the leadership void left as a result of a weakened Catholic Church. Moreover, it encouraged the spirit of questioning challenged power structures, a skepticism that would then lead to the scientific revolution. Maybe the church has been wrong about science too. And the Enlightenment. Maybe divine right is a terrible basis for government. Topics that we will be getting to in future lessons. For now, in your notes, add a sentence or two about the Protestant Reformation and its impact.